February 1991, 02:17 hours, southern Iraq. The desert was silent. So silent, in fact, that the Soviet-trained Iraqi tank company felt safe moving under the cover of night. Their engines whispered across sand dunes, tracks muffled by carefully chosen routes. 24 T-72s crept forward in wedge formation. No headlights, no comms bursts, just encrypted signals between columns and shortwave IR flashes. Inside Tank 4, the commander adjusted his night vision goggles. Grainy, low contrast, barely usable. He switched to thermals. Worse. The heat from his own engine blurred the optics. He sighed and scanned the darkness again. Nothing. 2 kilometers north, something stirred. Above the dunes, moving barely faster than a fast jog, a dark shape crept just 10 meters off the deck. No lights, no radar ping. The rotors were quiet, muted by design, tuned for stealth. 2 pilots sat in tandem, both helmets downlinked to a fire control system tracking every tank's exhaust plume from over 6,000 meters away. The aircraft didn't need eyes. It had heat. It was an AH-64 Apache. The front seat gunner blinked and shifted focus. "Target 4, he said calmly. "Confirmed," said the pilot. "Lacing now." A soft pulse, silent, invisible to the tank. "Hellfire away." The missile launched without a roar. Just a soft pop, and then a streak of infrared death slicing through the cold night. Tank 4 never moved. The crew never saw a thing. They were talking about switch rotation when the missile pierced their turret from above and exploded the ammo rack. The tank didn't just burn, it vaporized. Seconds later, another missile launched, then another. 8 missiles in 90 seconds. Each one found a glowing T-72 by its heat signature alone. The tanks were stationary. They were scanning. But they couldn't see what was hunting them. They weren't being outgunned. They were being out-evolved. By 02:31, half the tank company was destroyed. The rest retreated, confused, blind, and broadcasting panicked reports about jets or snipers. The Apache never climbed. It circled low, repositioned, and waited for heat signatures to reappear. One Soviet advisor monitoring the engagement screamed into the encrypted field net, "You're not under airstrike. You're being hunted." By the time sunrise broke over the desert, the wreckage told the truth. No planes, no bombs, just shattered turrets, burnt sand, and the signature of precision death from the darkness. Soviet armored doctrine had long held a brutal, unshakable belief. Tanks ruled the battlefield. From Kursk to Kabul, massed armor, coordinated assault columns, and aggressive shock maneuvers had crushed infantry positions and overwhelmed static defenses. The tank, especially the T-72, was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of dominance, and it was built to fight forward. Soviet planners assumed that visibility, optical range, daylight recognition, and close-range sensor tracking was how battles were decided. They trained their tank crews accordingly: fast movement, line-of-sight fire, overwhelming numbers. Night operations were considered a liability. Thermal imaging was scarce. In most units, it was either unreliable or non-existent. As a result, they believed darkness offered safety. A tactical pause. A reset point. No major engagements should occur between 2100 and 500 unless supported by FLIRs, recon units, or heavy artillery cover. Helicopters, in particular, were classified as limited visibility assets. They could scout, they could skirmish. But in Soviet eyes, no rotary wing aircraft could engage tanks head-on, let alone hunt them like prey. This assumption was embedded in every level of training. In the manuals, night combat doctrine for T-72s focused on defensive positioning. Vehicles were expected to remain still, use passive sensors, and wait for dawn or ISR support. Nighttime was for survivability, not aggression. That doctrine was already dead, and no one in Moscow knew it. On the other side of the world, the United States had invested billions into changing how its forces operated in the dark. And at the center of that investment stood one machine, The AH-64 Apache. It wasn't designed to challenge Soviet armor in broad daylight. It was designed to erase it in pitch-black silence. The Apache's designers assumed the battlefield would be non-linear, chaotic, and heavily obscured. So they didn't make it fast. They made it omniscient. Forward-looking infrared, FLIR, laser rangefinders, and real-time digital mapping let its gunners see farther in the dark than a T-72 could see at high noon. The Soviet tank officer, when engaging in darkness, could barely detect a heat source beyond 800 meters. The Apache could lock and fire a Hellfire missile from over 6 kilometers away, while hovering, masked behind terrain. This mismatch wasn't theoretical. It was lethal. In one briefing, a U.S. Apache instructor described it bluntly. "They need to see us to win. We don't need to see them. We just need their heat." But none of this was known inside the walls of Soviet tank schools. They still taught active hull-down positioning and assumed that low light made tanks harder to spot. No doctrine existed for avoiding a silent predator that struck from beyond visual range using thermals, data links, and satellite maps. They believed helicopters were noisy. They believed missiles needed visual guidance. They believed that if they stayed still, they would be safe until dawn. All of it wrong. And they wouldn't realize it until their turrets exploded. In Soviet strategy, tanks were not just blunt instruments. They were philosophical anchors. The T-72, one of the USSR's most exported and revered armored platforms, had been crafted for a very specific kind of war. High speed, massed formations storming enemy lines under a shield of artillery and air defense. This was doctrine forged by victory at Kursk, refined in Hungary, and hardened in Afghanistan. It assumed daylight warfare, proximity engagements, and a battlefield controlled by momentum and mass. Every feature of the T-72 was designed around this vision. Its optics were basic but rugged, suited for close-in spotting. Its armor prioritized frontal protection, made to absorb direct fire. Its communication systems were limited, designed for immediate local coordination, not deep intel sharing. And its kill chain? It began with visual contact and ended with a 125mm cannon shell. This system worked, as long as the enemy could be seen, but it was about to encounter something that rewrote the rules. The AH-64 Apache didn't operate by sight lines or frontal armor logic. It didn't rush the enemy or line up on ridge lines. It used invisible geometry, scanning for heat signatures, mapping terrain via radar altimeters, and hovering silently in nap-of-the-earth patterns where neither radar nor eyes could find it. It didn't need mass, it didn't need speed, it only needed confirmation, and then the Hellfire would fly. This dissonance between design and threat exposure created fatal gaps in Soviet planning. They trained T-72 crews to engage enemy armor at 1,500 to 2,500 meters. They emphasized crew drills for fast loading, turret rotation, and return fire within seconds of spotting the target. But what happens when the first shot comes from 6,000 meters away from an aircraft you can't hear that hits you from above? You don't fight back. You don't respond. You just burn. In one grim after-action report from a Warsaw Pact exercise simulating night combat, a Soviet tank officer noted, "If they see first, we die first. The tank has no night teeth." The doctrine was supposed to guarantee armor survivability through movement, not concealment. But in the face of Apache operations, movement only made you hotter, more visible to thermal imaging, easier to range, faster to die. The AH-64 introduced a terrifying inversion. Stillness didn't protect you. Motion made you bleed. That realization shattered an entire layer of Soviet thinking. They had built tanks for high-speed frontal wars. The U.S. had built helicopters to erase tanks in slow, patient darkness. And the moment those two philosophies collided, steel would lose to silence. It was supposed to be a routine test deployment, an armored probe through a desert corridor near the Kuwaiti border. The T-72 platoons moved at tactical speed, staggered by terrain features and short commands from embedded Soviet advisors. The sun had set 3 hours earlier. Visibility was near zero. But the mission was clear. Establish presence, signal strength, and if engaged, hold position until first light. At 23:47 hours, the lead T-72's infrared scope picked up nothing. No movement, no heat, no signs of contact. But 18 kilometers away, a different set of eyes had already been watching for 2 hours. Hovering silently just 25 feet off the ground, nestled in a fold of black rock, 2 AH-64 Apaches scanned the desert using forward-looking infrared. They didn't need permission. Their targets had been identified via satellite and drones earlier that evening. What they needed now was confirmation of thermal profile and geometric clearance. The first Hellfire was launched at 23:52. It didn't roar. It whispered. From over 5 kilometers away, the missile tracked a moving exhaust plume and struck the lead T-72 just below the turret line. The explosion illuminated the desert in a blink, and then returned to silence. The second Apache loosed its round 5 seconds later. Then a third. Then a fourth. By 00:03, 8 Hellfires had hit their marks. 4 tanks burned. 3 were immobilized. 1 tried to reverse. Its turret whirled frantically, scanning the dunes. But another missile streaked in from the opposite flank and penetrated its armor clean through. Not one T-72 had returned fire. They never saw the helicopters. The embedded Soviet advisor, crouched in an infantry dugout 600 meters behind the column, radioed for artillery cover. The reply was chilling. There is no target. There is only sky. Thermal logs from the Apaches showed exact impact angles, 0 retargeting delays, and full kill confirmation, all without a single ground-based laser designation. The gunships had done it alone, using only FLIR, onboard navigation, and crew coordination. Even the Americans were stunned by the effectiveness. Post-strike analysis revealed that every single tank crew was killed or incapacitated before they knew what hit them. The average time between thermal acquisition and missile launch, 7.3 seconds. In the debrief, one Apache gunner explained the kill loop. We don't hunt like jets. We're not passing over. We're orbiting predators. We wait, and when they light up, we send the shot. This wasn't just a surprise attack. It was a methodical erasure. 1 platform, 1 team, 1 night, and an entire armored unit eliminated in the dark. The first impossible event wasn't that Apaches could destroy tanks. It was that they could do it without ever being seen. When the first battle reports reached Soviet Defense Command, the response was cold and immediate. Denial. The numbers didn't make sense. 8 tanks destroyed, no return fire, no air defense engagement. No surviving crew had reported seeing a jet, a helicopter, or even hearing a flyover. The official stance was that the tanks had been sabotaged or struck by precision munitions from a high-flying bomber, maybe an F-111 or a B-52 using laser designators. The idea that helicopters could operate unseen, unheard, and lethal in total darkness from beyond the T-72's optical range was dismissed as a Western fabrication. But facts began to pile up. First came the satellite imagery. Even with Soviet-controlled orbital paths, the post-strike photos captured something undeniable. Impact craters with vertical blast signatures, consistent with downward missile strikes, not high-velocity bombs from jets, and not artillery. Then came the thermal decay models, smuggled from European intelligence partners. These showed heat signatures consistent with Hellfire missile strikes, launched in succession from low altitude and from the same approximate quadrant of sky. Still, Soviet brass resisted. They clung to an older theory, that American forces had used drones or forward observers to laze the tanks for a strike aircraft. But when they examined the blast fragments recovered from the wreckage, they found composite fins and carbon scoring patterns that matched AGM-114A Hellfires, missiles designed specifically for attack helicopters. The internal conflict worsened when GRU field assets began debriefing Iraqi crews. Survivors described what sounded like ghost attacks. No warning, no lock-on signal, no radar alerts, just sudden violent eruptions. The wrecks showed clean penetrations, most from the top down. Still, the final blow came from an intercepted radio transmission. During a separate engagement, 72 hours later, Soviet field monitors captured encrypted U.S. air comms. Translated and decrypted, they revealed Apache crews coordinating via coded pulses. No drones, no fixed-wing assets, just Apaches, autonomous, lethal, and coordinated only with each other. One stunned Soviet officer scribbled in his after-action notes, "They do not sweep, they do not support. They arrive in silence, fire in darkness, and vanish before a counterattack can be imagined." This defied every assumption Soviet planners had held since the 1960s. They had built air defense grids to counter speed, not patience. They expected saturation bombing, not surgical midnight stalking. And perhaps, worst of all, they trained their tank crews to wait out the dark. But now the dark belonged to the Americans. Back at the Franz Military Academy, where Soviet ground doctrine was forged and revised, the general staff scrambled to explain what their forward units were reporting. An entire battalion of modern tanks destroyed by helicopters at night, without radar warning? Impossible. A new theory emerged. Circulated first in classified lectures, then in white papers marked, "Do not disseminate outside Warsaw Pact." The premise was straightforward and reassuring. The Americans were cheating. They used fixed-wing aircraft. According to this line of thought, F-117 Nighthawks or F-111 Aardvarks had performed the strike under the cover of ECM interference. The Apache sightings were dismissed as misidentified silhouettes or decoys. Soviet analysts asserted that no rotary wing platform could loiter that long without being heard, or fire that accurately without external guidance. This was a comforting lie. But it didn't survive contact with real data. Recovered shrapnel didn't match any known bomb casings. It wasn't the shape of Make 82s or laser-guided paveways. The fragments were curved, modular, lightweight. And they matched Hellfire missiles specifically designed to be fired from helicopters, not jets. Even more damning were audio patterns from SIGINT logs. Forward Soviet radar stations had picked up rotor beat harmonics, low-frequency pulses consistent with tandem rotor aircraft loitering at treetop level. These weren't the high-pitched thermal signatures of fast movers. They were slow, deliberate, and hovering. But by far the most decisive evidence came from U.S. thermal gun camera footage, leaked through Western press outlets. Grainy, time-stamped, and unmistakable. The videos showed Apache fire control officers identifying tank silhouettes, tracking range on screen, and firing missiles in total silence. The crosshairs aligned. A lock tone beeped. And then, strike. Still, Soviet thinkers clung to the theory. Because accepting the alternative meant confronting the brutal truth that a tactical helicopter, once considered an afterthought in armored warfare, had become the main predator of their heaviest ground asset. It meant rewriting the entire idea of battlefield sequence. Traditionally, scout sees, tank fires, air support strikes. Now, Apache sees, Apache fires, tank dies. There was no middle, no warning, no return fire, just a loop closed by thermal imaging and a crew trained to kill without being seen. The theory crumbled under scrutiny. The data didn't match jet profiles. The terrain didn't support fast-mover engagement. The kill timing was too tight for a bomber loiter. Even after multiple confirmations, one Soviet general reportedly growled, "It is not possible. A helicopter does not kill a tank. A tank kills a helicopter." He was wrong. And every hour the theory persisted. Another Apache squadron proved it, quietly, methodically, in total darkness. As the fixed-wing explanation disintegrated, Soviet analysts pivoted again, this time toward a more palatable alternative: unmanned coordination. If helicopters had struck the tanks, they must have been guided in real time by drones, Western satellites, or forward special forces with laser designators. That would explain the accuracy. That would explain the synchronization. The Apaches weren't autonomous. They were merely weapons in a larger web. The real threat, in this theory, wasn't the helicopter. It was the invisible hand guiding it. For a brief moment, this theory held weight. The USSR had already encountered American drone surveillance in prior skirmishes. Small reconnaissance UAVs like the Pioneer and Jinat 750 had shown up in the Mediterranean and over Afghanistan. Soviet advisors had also noted laser spotting in El Salvador and Libya. In their minds, the U.S. didn't trust machines. It relied on network targeting. But this assumption revealed how deeply they misunderstood the Apache. What made the AH-64 revolutionary wasn't just its firepower or range. It was its self-contained lethality. Unlike Soviet Mi-24s, which required visual confirmation and external spotters for precision, Apaches operated in independent kill loops. Each two-man crew controlled navigation, thermal tracking, radar mapping, and fire control from within the cockpit. No external designation required. When a U.S. Army gunner pulled the trigger, he wasn't waiting on an uplink or a forward observer. He already had lock-on from a laser rangefinder embedded in his targeting pod. His co-pilot had mapped the engagement zone minutes before visual contact. The missile launch wasn't the start of the attack. It was the end of a process that began miles earlier. Soviet intelligence failed to grasp this because they'd never built a system like it. Their helicopters relied on central direction, ground spotters, or close air control doctrine. Autonomy was dangerous. Initiative from junior crews was discouraged. Their Mi-24s were powerful, but blind without orders. The Apache didn't wait for orders. It made decisions. When U.S. intelligence released redacted gun tape from a night operation, it shattered the second theory. The footage showed no spotters, no laser guidance from the ground. Just a pilot, a gunner, and a symphony of thermal locks, ranging data and fast trigger sequences, firing Hellfires into targets unseen by human eyes, but perfectly visible through machines. The Soviets couldn't believe it, not because the footage was fake, but because it showed something their doctrine couldn't replicate. A helicopter flying alone, without radar support, wiping out tanks in complete silence. One GRU colonel summed it up. "If that crew sees us, we die. If they don't see us, we might still die." The second theory collapsed like the first. And as the wreckage of T-72s piled up beneath moonless skies, the real nightmare set in. The Americans weren't coordinating kills through a system. The Apache was the system. The Soviets didn't just lose tanks on the battlefield. They lost clarity in the war room. For years, the Red Army's main intelligence directorate, GRU, had dismissed American rotary wing development as a side effort. Their dossiers on the AH-64 Apache were shallow, outdated, and fatally optimistic. The last comprehensive report dated back to 1985 and focused more on the helicopter's procurement schedule than its tactical doctrine. Now, as burning T-72s smoldered in the dark and after-action reports stacked higher each week, it became clear. Soviet intelligence had missed the revolution entirely. They underestimated the sensor suite. Apaches weren't flying blind. They were operating as if it were noon at midnight. Soviet analysts had noted FLIR and laser rangefinders in the specs, but assumed they were unreliable in dust, smoke, or fast maneuvers. They weren't. They were game changers. Thermal imaging on the Apache could detect and track tank exhaust plumes, engine heat, and even the friction burn of metal treads against sand. Rangefinders synced this data with GPS and onboard maps, building a live 3D model of the battlefield in real time. In contrast, Soviet T-72s operated with optics designed in the 1970s. Most frontline crews lacked modern thermal scopes altogether. At best, they had passive IR sensors with minimal resolution, functionally useless against a helicopter hidden behind terrain, especially at night. But the biggest failure? Misjudging the Apache's engagement envelope. Soviet intelligence assumed helicopters posed a threat only at close range, within 1,500 to 2,000 meters. This was based on Mi-24 doctrine and RPG-style anti-armor tactics. What they didn't grasp was that Apaches could strike from 6 to 8 kilometers depending on elevation and loadout. This rendered standard tank defenses obsolete. By the time a T-72 crew heard rotors or saw a muzzle flash, the missile was already seconds from impact. This gap in intelligence wasn't just about equipment, it was about mentality. Soviet war doctrine treated helicopters as battlefield supplements, something to harass infantry, support flanks, or transport troops, not primary tank killers. The idea that a helicopter could wipe out a battalion of armored vehicles was unthinkable. That blindness bled into war games and planning. Red team simulations didn't account for Apache-style strikes. They still modeled tanks engaging other tanks at 2,000 meters, or infantry taking the lead in night operations. There were no scenarios where a handful of gunships unaided could destroy dozens of vehicles without suffering a single casualty. But it had already happened, multiple times. And while Soviet analysts struggled to backfill new data into old frameworks, American pilots refined their techniques. They began terrain masking, hiding behind dunes and ridgelines to launch missiles without ever breaking visual cover. Some Apache units even coordinated false fades, turning off active IR for seconds at a time to fake withdrawal, then re-engaging when targets relaxed. The Soviets never saw it coming, quite literally. In one classified GRU post-mortem, an internal reviewer wrote, "Our models failed not because of incorrect data, but because they assumed the enemy had limits. He did not." That line was later redacted from circulation. But the battlefield had already said it louder. The AH-64 Apache wasn't just a helicopter. It was the embodiment of battlefield asymmetry. Every bolt, every optic, every missile rack served one singular goal: to make sure the enemy never saw the shot coming. From the outside, it looked like a conventional attack platform. Two-seater tandem cockpit, stub wings for armament. But what the Soviets never understood, until it was too late, was that the Apache was not built to fight like a helicopter. It was built to operate like a low-altitude sniper, layered with digital dominance and sensor fusion far beyond Soviet reach. Here's how it worked. Step 1. Detection without exposure. The Apache's radar altimeter allowed it to fly just feet above the ground, hugging terrain contours while its FLIR, forward-looking infrared, scanned the battlefield for heat signatures. The crew didn't need visual contact. The gunner saw the world as glowing blobs. Every engine, every soldier, every muzzle flash rendered in sharp thermal contrast. The pilot navigated using terrain-following navigation, TFN. That meant flying through valleys behind dunes or through riverbeds, silent, unseen, and beneath radar arcs. Step 2. Target acquisition and fire planning. Once a heat signature was locked, the gunner used a laser rangefinder to get an exact distance. A digital fire control computer then calculated trajectory, angle, and flight time. In most cases, this process took under 5 seconds. The entire kill sequence, from spotting a tank to launching a Hellfire, could occur before the tank ever noticed anything was near. But here's where it became a system, not just a vehicle. The Apache could share targets. Using data links like the Improved Data Modem, IDM, one Apache could scan and transmit exact coordinates to others in the flight. That meant a crew flying 4 kilometers behind could fire at a tank they hadn't even seen themselves, using the targeting data from their lead. This was lethal synchronization. Step 3. Silent kill, rapid reposition. After firing, the Apache didn't linger. Its doctrine emphasized the shoot-and-scoot model. Fire from behind cover, descend or mask behind terrain, pop up elsewhere. This created the illusion of multiple attackers. In reality, it could be just one bird, dancing around a terrified armored column. The Hellfire missile, its primary anti-armor weapon, was laser-guided, capable of top-down attacks where tank armor was weakest. Its kill probability, especially against exposed or moving armor, was over 90%. And even when the missiles ran out, the Apache still had the 30mm M230 chain gun, a fully articulated cannon slaved to the gunner's helmet. Wherever he looked, the gun pointed. This made short work of soft targets, infantry, and lightly armored vehicles. But what truly broke Soviet doctrine was the pilot-gunner separation. In the Apache, the front-seater, gunner, and rear-seater, pilot, had overlapping but independent controls. The pilot flew the aircraft while the gunner conducted reconnaissance and targeting. This separation allowed for simultaneous navigation and destruction, no delay, no confusion, and no reliance on external control. Soviet helicopters didn't have this. Their Mi-24s required visual locks. They couldn't strike from 6 kilometers away, and they were too loud, too tall, and too rigid in their flight profiles. By contrast, the Apache could operate in total autonomy, engaging multiple targets, coordinating with other aircraft, and completing its kill chain in less time than it took a T-72 to rotate its turret. In one after-action analysis, an American Apache commander described it best. "We don't wait to be targeted. We finish the kill before they figure out where the sky went wrong." For Soviet officers watching their armor disappear, that was the horror. This wasn't a duel. It was an execution. By machine. March 1991. 01:28 hours. Al-Busaya region, Iraq. The night was ink black, moonless, windless. A perfect night for armor according to the Soviet playbook. And yet, 21 T-72s dug into defensive positions were about to face a war they couldn't even see. The Soviet advisors embedded with the Iraqi 12th Armored Brigade were confident. Their tanks were entrenched, hull down, staggered in overlapping arcs with preset artillery coordinates. Flank protection was provided by BMPs, and an anti-aircraft battery was stationed to the rear. Visibility was poor, but in Soviet logic that meant advantage. Defense held, enemies hesitated. They waited. What came instead was total erasure. At 01:43, the first explosion tore through the darkness. No warning, no sound until impact. Tank 6 disintegrated in a flash, turret blown sky high. Seconds later, another Hellfire pierced the armor of Tank 14, then Tank 3, then 7. By 01:50, 6 tanks were gone. The air defense crew still hadn't seen a single aircraft. Frantic radio calls begged for confirmation. Was it a bomber? Drones? Artillery? Nothing made sense. Because what none of them could see, circling low just behind a dune line, were 2 AH-64 Apache longbows, running staggered FLIR sweeps, data linked to a command Overwatch aircraft, and feeding each other heat coordinates in real time. At 01:52, the Apaches repositioned, barely shifting 400 meters, and launched again. 4 more Hellfires, 4 more kills. The BMPs began firing blindly into the night, hoping to hit something. Anything. It was useless. Apaches watched their muzzle flashes through thermal lenses, returned fire with pinpoint cannon bursts, and turned the vehicles into burning scrap. At 02:00, a single T-72 broke formation, reversing at full speed. It exploded mid-turn. Its engine block registered first on thermal, and that was all the missile needed. The remaining tanks tried to rotate turrets and brace. They might as well have been statues. By 02:12, the battlefield was silent, except for the low whir of burning engines and the distant thump of wreckage collapsing in on itself. 17 tanks destroyed, 3 disabled, 1 abandoned, its crew having fled on foot. 0 American casualties, 0 American aircraft spotted. The Soviet advisors on site were speechless. One of them, Major Voronov, filed a coded after-action report stating, "This was not an engagement. It was one-sided liquidation. Our forces did not participate in combat. They were simply extinguished." The humiliation didn't end on the field. Back in Baghdad, video footage of the wreckage aired on CNN. Smoking tank husks, glowing remains of what was supposed to be an impenetrable armored line. It wasn't just a loss. It was a broadcasted defeat. And the worst part? No one saw it happen. No thunder of jets, No screaming bombs, just quiet rotors in the night, and missiles fired from machines that were never supposed to get that close, let alone win. That night, Soviet tank officers watching the footage didn't see a weapon system. They saw a truth they couldn't unlearn. The age of armor had ended, and it had been ended by a ghost in the dark. In the cold rooms of Soviet armored command, doctrine was not just policy, it was faith. The tank, in Soviet ideology, was the decisive instrument of modern war. From the thunderous breakthroughs of World War II to the massed exercises on the plains of Eastern Europe, armored warfare was their religion. But after the Apache strikes in Iraq, that faith shattered. The images coming from CNN, from military satellites, from burned-out tank yards along the Euphrates, showed a battlefield where tanks didn't dominate. They died, quickly, silently, without warning, without response. And that reality ignited panic across every tier of Soviet strategy. First, the equipment crisis. The T-72, once the pride of Soviet exports, was now exposed. Its optics, fire control, and night fighting capabilities were not merely outdated. They were irrelevant. American helicopters were engaging from beyond its detection envelope. Its reactive armor meant nothing against top-down Hellfire strikes. Its heavy chassis, once a symbol of survivability, was now a glowing thermal beacon. Second, the doctrine crisis. Soviet manuals dictated that tanks push through resistance and overwhelm with mass and momentum. But how do you mass when the first 5 units die before firing a shot? How do you maneuver when movement makes you more visible to FLIR? How do you execute a combined arms thrust when your air defense never sees the enemy? The strategy collapsed because it was based on an assumption that combat required visibility. The Americans no longer fought by that rule. Their Apaches turned night into day, distance into death, and presence into dominance. Third, the export crisis. Nations that had purchased Soviet tanks, India, Iraq, Syria, Libya, now questioned everything. If a handful of helicopters could erase entire armored battalions in minutes, then what were they buying? What was the point of hundreds of tanks if one Apache squadron could neutralize them before breakfast? One Syrian defense analyst summed it up privately. We didn't purchase tanks, we purchased targets. Even inside the Soviet Union, voices began to whisper that the Western advantage wasn't in tanks or missiles, but in systems thinking, integration, sensor fusion, real-time data sharing, flexibility at the crew level. Soviet doctrine emphasized control from the top. Apache crews made decisions in orbit. In one classified review, a Soviet colonel wrote, "We have built a force to engage sighted enemies. They have built one to eliminate unseen ones." It was an ideological defeat. Tanks were not obsolete, but the way the Soviets used them, the way they imagined war would unfold, was. And once that realization took root, it didn't just change tactics, it changed belief. Because for all the theories, drills, and steel, one truth was now unavoidable. If you couldn't fight at night, you couldn't fight at all. Long after the flames died in southern Iraq, long after the last Hellfire missile struck home, the Apache lingered, in memory, in doctrine, and in nightmares. For Soviet tank officers, the AH-64 wasn't just a helicopter. It was a reaper that flew in silence, a weapon that erased the rules they'd trained by their entire lives. They had believed in mass, visibility, and firepower. The Apache punished all three. It taught them that in modern war, you do not need to see to be seen. You do not need to move to be hunted. You do not need to shoot to be targeted. The battlefield was no longer a contest of steel and bravery. It was a contest of information and invisibility. The haunting part? There was no counter. Even years after Desert Storm, former Warsaw Pact officers told stories about the night of no noise, when their best armor vanished without warning. Some believed they were facing invisible drones. Others thought the Americans had used orbital weapons. But the truth was even more terrifying. It was just a helicopter, just a machine, just 2 men floating above the dark, with all the time in the world to decide who lived and who didn't. The AH-64 became more than a battlefield tool. It became a psychological weapon, a reminder to every Soviet-trained commander that the West had entered a different phase of warfare, one where data moved faster than orders, and kills happened before strategy began. To this day, its silhouette remains iconic. Its systems have evolved. Its range has grown. Its lethality has multiplied. But the idea is unchanged. The Apache still flies low. It still sees in perfect darkness. And when it moves, something dies. It is not a vehicle. It is a message. And that message is simple. You will not see us, but we will end you.